Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're really getting into it with The Personal MBA by Josh Kaufman. You guys wanted the good stuff, right? The business stuff that always matters. So we're talking timeless business principles, those bedrock ideas that work whether you're running a huge company or, just trying to get ahead in your career.
And what's great is how Kaufman makes all these big ideas easy to understand. He cuts through all the jargon and gets straight to the point.
Totally. One of the first things that caught my eye was this idea that business at its heart is actually pretty simple. Like he lays out these 5 key elements, the things every successful business has. But is it really that simple? What do you think?
It's really interesting, because those 5 elements, they're like the foundation of everything.
Mm-hmm.
They apply whether you're running a small online shop or like a massive corporation. It boils down to creating something people actually want and will pay for, getting it to them, and making sure you're actually making money at the end of the day.
Right. That makes sense, in theory. But in reality, I'm guessing it's not always so straightforward.
Oh, absolutely not. And Kaufman, he doesn't shy away from the challenges. He even kind of questions the whole traditional MBA thing, like you don't need a fancy degree to understand the fundamentals.
Wait, really? He's saying skip the whole MBA route. Now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So it's not that he's totally against MBAs, but he thinks you can learn all the practical stuff without spending a ton of money and, get bogged down in all this theoretical stuff. Instead, he's all about building what he calls a lattice work of mental models. It's basically taking knowledge from different areas and using it to make smarter business decisions.
So it's like you're becoming this well-rounded thinker and using those different perspectives to tackle business problems.
Exactly. You wouldn't run a tech company the same way you'd run a bakery.
Right.
Each one needs a different way of thinking about problems and solutions.
Okay, that makes sense. But with so many different mental models out there, are there any that are essential for success? What should we be focusing on?
One that really stood out to me was this whole perceived value thing. It's this idea that you can't just create something valuable. You got to make sure your customers see it as valuable too. And get this, that perception directly affects how much they'll pay. Think about those high-end brands.
Yeah, it's true. People will pay hundreds, even thousands, for a designer bag when a regular bag would work just as well, right? It's all about the brand, the image, that perceived value.
Exactly. And Kaufman talks about using what he calls iteration cycles to really hone in on that perceived value. He gives the example of those Vibram 5-finger shoes, those ones with the individual toes.
Oh, yeah. Those were everywhere for a while. They were so out there. I got to admit, I was curious.
Right. And that was the whole point. They were different. They were eye-catching. And because people were talking about barefoot running back then, they kind of tapped into that. They created this perception of being innovative.
So it's not enough to just have a good product. You got to have a good story. That's really interesting. What happens when you think you have an amazing idea, you're convinced it's valuable, but people just aren't buying it?
That's where it's really important to understand what Kaufman calls critically important assumptions, or CIAs. These are the make or break assumptions you're making about your idea. Let's say you're opening a fancy coffee shop in a small town, and you think people will pay $8 for a latte.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right. But what if, after you open, you realize people in that town are used to paying $3 for their coffee? That assumption, being off by that much, could be a real problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So how do you avoid falling into that trap? How do you test those assumptions before, investing a ton of time and money?
That's where testing is super important. Don't just go with your gut, even if it feels right?
Yeah.
Talk to your potential customers. Do surveys, that kind of thing. Figure out those CIAs early on, and it'll make a big difference.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of that saying, measure twice, cut once, Speaking of measuring, that whole section on marketing and the psychology of it was really interesting. It's crazy how our brains are kind of wired to respond to things like scarcity, newness, even a little bit of controversy.
It's true. And marketers, they're really good at tapping into that. Think about it. Those limited time offers, the exclusive deals, all that plays on our desire to not miss out.
And let's not forget those controversial ads that everyone talks about. Even if people hate them, they're still talking about the brand, right?
Exactly. Controversy can be a powerful tool as long as it's used strategically.
Right. There's definitely a fine line there.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to just have a great product. You have to understand how to present it, how to connect with what people want, and maybe even what they're afraid of.
Absolutely. It's like this whole psychology of persuasion thing. figuring out what makes people tick.
It makes you think about all the times we make decisions based on that stuff, like that limited time offer that makes you buy something even though you don't really need it.
Oh, totally. Those marketing tricks, they get us all sometimes. But, speaking of decisions, there's this other part of Kaufman's book that really got me thinking, this whole idea that running a business is about, mastering yourself, too.
Oh, absolutely. He gets into all this stuff about productivity and setting goals and even dealing with fear. It's like he snuck in a whole personal development course into a business book. What were some of the things that really stood out to you?
One that I really connected with was this idea of most important tasks. He calls them MITs. It's all about really focusing on what matters. Don't get bogged down in that huge to-do list,
Yeah.
Just pick those 2 or 3 things that'll have the biggest impact and knock those out.
I love that. Focusing on the big wins, the things that really move the needle. It's so easy to get caught up in the small stuff and forget about what's really important.
Exactly. And when you focus on those MITs, it creates this momentum,
Yeah.
You start the day feeling like you've already accomplished something, and it just kind of snowballs from there.
Have you found that to be true in your own work? Have you tried using that MIT approach?
Oh, yeah, totally. Just the other week, I was drowning in all these little tasks, but then I took a step back and, figured out my 3 MITs for the day. And you know what? I got way more done, and I felt a lot less stressed about it.
There's something to be said for a little organization, right? It's like it frees up your brain power for the stuff that really matters.
Totally. But on the flip side of that, Kaufman also talks about how important it is to understand your own, psychology when it comes to stuff like fear and procrastination. We all have those voices in our heads that try to hold us back,
Oh, tell me about it. I'm the queen of procrastination. But seriously, I'm curious to hear what Kaufman suggests. Does he have any tips for, quieting those negative thoughts?
Yeah, he does. He talks about recognizing those thought patterns.
Yeah.
The ones that tell you you're not good enough or you're going to fail. Just being aware of them is a huge first step.
Ugh, those thoughts are the worst.
Right. But once you can, spot them, you can start to challenge them. Ask yourself, is this really true? What evidence do I have?
Like you're putting those thoughts on trial, right?
Exactly. And then once you've challenged those negative thoughts, you can replace them with something more positive. It's about, shifting your mindset.
I love that. Reframing those negative thoughts. It's like hitting the reset button.
Totally. And another thing Kaufman talks about is the power of what he calls guiding structure. Basically, it's about designing your environment to support your goals.
Oh, so setting yourself up for success, removing distractions and that kind of thing.
Exactly. If you're trying to eat healthier, don't keep junk food in your house. Or if you want to write a book, make a space for yourself where you can focus. Make it easier to do the things you want to do and harder to get sidetracked.
That is such a simple concept, but so smart. It's about being intentional with your surroundings. I'm a big believer in that.
Me too. And it ties into building good habits too. The more you can automate those good decisions, the easier it gets.
Absolutely. That's a game changer. Speaking of things that can change the game, that whole section on the power of collaboration was really eye-opening for me. It's easy to get stuck in that lone wolf mentality, especially when you're first starting out.
Oh, I know what you mean. But Kaufman, he makes such a strong case for working with others. He talks about comparative advantage, which is this idea that you should focus on what you're good at and then find people who are good at the things you're not.
Right. It's like you don't have to be good at everything.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging your strengths and finding people who complement those strengths. Teamwork really does make the dream work, right?
It really does. And it's not just about finding people with the right skills. It's also about building that trust and rapport, that open communication.
Absolutely. That's where those soft skills come in, Communication, empathy, listening, those are all so important.
For sure. And here's where Kaufman throws in something that seems kind of counterintuitive. He talks about using what he calls damaging admissions to actually build trust. Wait, really? Damaging admissions? Like admitting to your weaknesses?
It sounds strange, right? But he says that being upfront about your limitations can actually make you seem more trustworthy. It shows you're self-aware and honest, and it might even make people more likely to trust you when you talk about your strengths.
That is so interesting. I never thought about it that way before. You become more relatable by acknowledging your imperfections.
Totally. It's all about being vulnerable,
Yeah.
which can be really powerful. It creates this authenticity that people really respond to.
Definitely going to try that one out. It reminds me of that saying, honesty is the best policy. But before we move on from this whole working with others thing, there's one more thing I want to touch on. That concept of power dynamics.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. It's something we all deal with in any relationship, right?
Exactly. And Kaufman makes the point that everyone relies on power to get things done, but there's a big difference between compulsion and influence. Can you explain what he means by that?
Sure. Compulsion is like forcing people to do something, whereas influence is more about inspiring them. It's about persuasion, not pressure.
Oh, I see. So it's the difference between demanding something and inspiring someone to do it willingly.
Exactly. And while both approaches can, like, get results, influence is definitely the more sustainable approach. It builds stronger relationships.
It makes sense. No one wants to feel like they're being bossed around all the time. So how do you build that kind of influence? What does that look like in action?
Well, Kaufman talks about building authentic relationships, really understanding what motivates people, and then framing your requests in a way that aligns with their motivations.
So it's about finding that common ground, creating those win-win situations.
Exactly. And it takes time. You got to be patient and consistent. Building true influence doesn't happen overnight.
I like that. It's about nurturing those relationships, not forcing things.
For sure. It's about creating an environment where people feel valued and heard. And when people feel that way, they're way more likely to listen to your ideas and want to collaborate.
Absolutely. And speaking of collaboration, there's another part in the book that I thought was really insightful, and it kind of ties into this idea of mastering yourself, personal research and development. Kaufman talks about treating our personal growth like a business would approach R&D.
That's such a cool way to think about it, being intentional about your own growth.
Exactly. Instead of just hoping for the best, we should be more deliberate about investing in ourselves. What are some of the ways he suggests doing that?
One big thing he talks about is cultivating a growth mindset. It's basically this belief that your abilities aren't fixed. You can always learn and grow. It's about embracing challenges as opportunities.
So it's like reframing those I can't do this moments into I'm still learning moments.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to try new things, even if it means messing up sometimes.
Because mistakes are just opportunities to learn, right?
Exactly. And speaking of learning, Kaufman emphasizes the importance of, continuous learning. Reading, taking courses, having conversations with people who are experts in their field, never stop learning.
Yes. Always be learning. It's about staying curious. Okay, so we've covered self-mastery, collaboration, personal growth. Now, let's shift gears a little and talk about something that can sometimes seem like the opposite of personal growth. Systems.
Systems, yeah. People often have this negative reaction to that word,
It's true. We're all cogs in a machine. But Kaufman argues that systems, when they're done right, can actually be really freeing.
Exactly. And that's such an important point. A good system can take care of all those routine tasks and free up your time and energy for the stuff that really matters.
Right. So it's not about becoming a robot. It's about working smarter, not harder, right?
Exactly. It's about efficiency.
Okay, I like where this is going. But can you give me an example? How do you actually use this systems thinking stuff in everyday life?
Well, think about a checklist, right? Pilots use checklists before every flight. Surgeons use checklists before surgery. These are systems that help to reduce errors, even in those high-pressure situations.
That's a great example. And checklists aren't just for pilots and surgeons, are they?
Nope. You could use a checklist for anything. Packing for a trip, getting ready for a presentation, even cleaning your house.
Okay, now I'm seeing the light. It's not about being rigid, it's about creating these frameworks that make life easier.
Precisely. Like having a roadmap to follow.
I love that analogy. So, systems are like our trusty co-pilots, guiding us along the way. But what about when things don't go according to plan? Because, life happens. That's where resilience comes in, right?
Ah, yes, resilience. Another one of Kaufman's big ideas.
Mm-hmm.
It's essential for navigating all those curveballs that life throws at us.
Totally. Everyone's talking about grit and perseverance these days. But what are some practical things we can do to actually build resilience? How do we develop that inner strength?
Well, Kaufman talks about the importance of having a strong why. A clear sense of purpose, knowing your values. That gives you something to hold on to when things get tough.
Right. It's like that inner compass that keeps you on track.
Exactly. And when you're grounded in your why, you're less likely to get thrown off course by challenges or setbacks.
Okay, that makes sense. Like having an anchor in a storm.
Right. And speaking of support, Kaufman also emphasizes the importance of having a strong support system, those people you can lean on when you need it.
It's so true. Having that community, that tribe of people who believe in you can make all the difference.
Absolutely. And it's not just about receiving support, it's about giving it too, It's a two-way street.
Totally. Showing up for each other.
Exactly. It's about knowing that you're not alone in this. Everyone goes through tough times, and by supporting each other, we can get through anything.
I love that. There's so much power in that sense of community. But what about those times when, even when you have a plan and a good support system, things still go wrong? Kaufman calls those normal accidents, right?
He does. It's this idea that no matter how prepared you are, sometimes stuff just happens. It's about accepting that and, learning to bounce back.
So it's not about trying to avoid failure at all costs. It's about knowing how to deal with it when it happens.
Exactly. It's about reframing failure as feedback.
Oh, I like that. So it's about asking yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this?
Exactly. You shift your focus from the setback to the opportunity.
Turning those lemons into lemonade.
Exactly. And that's resilience in a nutshell, right? It's not about avoiding challenges. It's about facing them head on and coming out stronger.
I love that. Okay, so we've got self-mastery, collaboration, resilience. We're building quite the toolkit here.
We are. And to add to that toolkit, let's zoom out for a second, talk about a concept that's really important for understanding both systems and resilience: analysis.
Because to make something better, you have to understand how it works, right?
Exactly. And Kaufman has this great tool for analysis: deconstruction. It's basically breaking down a complex system into smaller, more manageable parts.
So it's like taking apart a clock to see how all the gears work together.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Once you understand how those individual parts work, you can see how they all fit together to make the whole thing function.
Okay, so deconstruction is about understanding the parts to understand the whole. But what about when you need to see that big picture? That's where measurement comes in, right?
Exactly. Kaufman talks about key performance indicators. He calls them KPIs. They're basically the metrics that tell you how well something is performing.
So it's like finding the signal in the noise.
Right. You track those KPIs to see what's working, what's not, and where you need to make adjustments.
Okay, so measurement is about using data to track progress. But what about when you have so much data that it gets overwhelming?
That's where sampling comes in. It's about taking a smaller, representative chunk of data to get a sense of the bigger picture without having to analyze everything.
So it's like tasting the soup to see if it needs more salt.
I love that. Perfect analogy. And just like with soup, you got to make sure you're getting a good sample,
Right. You don't want to just take a sip from the top. So it's about choosing your sample carefully.
Yes. And it's about understanding the limitations of sampling. No sample is perfect, so you have to be aware of that.
That makes sense. But even with a good sample, you can still get misleading results sometimes, right? That's where that confidence interval thing comes in.
Yes. The confidence interval basically tells you how confident you are in your results. It's like saying, we're pretty sure this is accurate, but there's always a chance it could be off by a little.
So it's about being upfront about the uncertainty in your data.
Exactly. And being transparent about that uncertainty when you're sharing your findings.
That's a good point. But let's move on to another big part of analysis: interpretation.
Because data without interpretation is useless, right?
It's true. It's like having a book you haven't read.
Right. And one of the tools Kaufman talks about for interpreting data is segmentation. It's about dividing your data into groups to find patterns and trends.
So it's like sorting your laundry into piles, like whites and colors.
Another great analogy. You got to make sure you're sorting your data in a way that makes sense,
Right, you don't want to mix your reds and whites. So It's about finding the right way to categorize your data.
Exactly. And once you've done that, you can start to draw conclusions and make better decisions.
Okay, I'm with you. So segmentation helps you dig into the data and find those insights. But even with all that, it's easy to forget about the human side of things, isn't it?
That's such a good point. Kaufman talks about the importance of humanization, which is basically remembering that at the end of the day, data is about people.
Right. There's a human story behind every data point.
Exactly. And understanding those stories can help you make better, more compassionate decisions.
It's like putting a face to the numbers.
Yes. And it's about recognizing that data isn't always objective. It can be influenced by biases and errors.
That's a really important thing to keep in mind. We have to be critical thinkers when it comes to data.
Absolutely. And we have to use data ethically and responsibly.
Data with a conscience. Remember that T-shirt idea from earlier? Data with a conscience. I still like it. But speaking of things that can be, powerful, but also kind of risky, let's talk about risk itself.
It's something you can't really avoid in business, right? That element of what if this goes wrong?
Exactly. And Kaufman, he actually says that every decision, every action comes with some risk. So it's not about pretending risk doesn't exist. It's about understanding it, managing it. What do you think?
I think he's right. There's that saying, the biggest risk is not taking any risks, If you're too scared to try anything new, you're not going to get very far.
So true. But how do you find that balance, between being careful and being, brave enough to go for it?
Well, Kaufman talks about the importance of being informed. Don't just jump into something blindly. Do your homework, analyze the downsides, have a backup plan, just in case.
So, always have a plan B, maybe even a plan C.
Exactly. Yeah. And be ready to adapt, Things change quickly in the business world, so you got to be able to roll with the punches.
Flexible, right?
Exactly. But even with the best plans, sometimes things just happen. That's where having those fail-safes can really help.
Fail-safes. Tell me more about those.
So a fail-safe is basically a backup system. If something goes wrong with the main system, the fail-safe kicks in to minimize the damage.
Oh, okay. So it's like having a spare tire in your car. Or one of those backup generators in case the power goes out.
Exactly. It's about thinking ahead and being prepared for the unexpected.
I like it. It's like having a safety net for your business. Gives you peace of mind, right?
Definitely. And that peace of mind is important, especially when things get crazy. But even with all the systems and backup plans in the world, there's one thing that can make or break a business.
Let me guess. People.
Got it. And that's where Kaufman's insights into human behavior are so valuable. He talks about those core human drives, the things that really motivate us.
Okay, break that down for me. What are those drives and how do they play out in business?
So he talks about 5 main ones: the drive to acquire things, the drive to bond with others, the drive to learn and grow, the drive to defend ourselves, and the drive to feel, experience emotions. These drives affect everything from what people buy to how they interact with each other.
So it's all about understanding what makes people tick.
Exactly. And once you get that, you can create products and messages that really resonate with people.
Because ultimately, business is about people, right? Connecting with people.
100%. It's about creating something of value for others and building relationships and, making a positive impact.
I love that. It's been awesome digging into all these business ideas with you. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's been fun.
And for everyone listening, here's something to think about this week. We've been talking about how these business principles apply to work, but what about the rest of your life? Could you use some of these ideas like systems thinking or understanding those human drives to improve other areas? Something to consider. And until next time, keep those brains buzzing.